Move over millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha are here. Gen Z, the ones who brought us TikTok dances and unapologetic middle parts, are now getting side-eyed by Gen Alpha, the kids who grew up swiping before they could walk. So what's the difference between these two tech-savvy titans? On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we'll show you how these two generations really stack up. Generation Z was born between 1995 and 2010, while Gen Alpha will consist of those born between 2010 and 2025. In the US, these are the two most diverse generations to ever exist. Gen Z is 48% non-white, while Gen Alpha is going to be the first majority non-white generation in history. But while their demographics are similar, they are far from the same. In fact, while it's hard to believe, they might actually be the most different generations ever. For starters, what's their preferred app? To no one's surprise, TikTok wins out with Gen Z, and they practically live on the app. Because why go outside when you can just dance for strangers? With studies showing that a quarter of Gen Z spends an average of 5 hours a day on China's favorite data collection app. But Gen Alpha's preferred app? It's by far YouTube. Forget about the TV commercials that you used to watch on Saturday mornings. Those are dead. Over half of Gen Alpha now finds out about brands on YouTube for the first time, while 47% of those in Gen Z first hear of them through social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok. And they're finding out about plenty of brands because both of these generations spend a lot of time online. Way more than you think. Gen Z is glued to screens for 9 hours a day. That's even more time than they spend sleeping, which means they're probably dreaming in memes by now. But before you get judgy, maybe you should check your own screen time and prepare to have a minor heart attack. You're probably one binge-watching session away from joining the club. Meanwhile, Gen Alpha children between 8 and 12 years old are putting in a solid 4 hours and 45 minutes daily on screens, still beating out nap time. But of course, part of this is likely due to the fact that Gen Alpha is still in school, and let's face it, it's hard but not impossible to be on your phone while you're in class. But that's not the only reason. Surprisingly, the youngest generation, or at least the parents, actually seem more aware of their screen time and are trying to reduce it. It might be hard to believe, but 74% of Gen Alpha say they'd rather go outside or cut back on tech to keep their sanity intact. And that's a pretty zen move for kids who have been glued to screens since the diaper days. 43% had tablets by age 6 and laptops by 9. It's like digital detoxing before they've even hit puberty. And yeah, Gen Alpha might end up mentally healthier than Gen Z, but let's be real, that's a bar you can trip over. It's impressive, though, that even at 8 to 10 years old, they're already thinking about mental health and disconnecting. But how much disconnecting are they really doing? Teachers say these kids can crunch numbers like tiny accountants, but when it comes to social skills, they're bombing. While Gen Alpha is very good with numbers and math, they are not keeping up at all with verbal skills and not wanting to socialize much in class. One teacher pointed out the decline, saying, "In the past, if I gave my students a few minutes of free time at the end of class, they would turn to a person next to them and start chatting. Now they immediately pull out their phones and put in their headphones. I can hear a pin drop in the room." On the flip side, Gen Z is hitting the mental health struggle bus hard. Surveys show a whopping 25% are riding the emotional roller coaster daily. Compare that to millennials and Gen X, where only 13% say they're feeling the same kind of all-the-time existential dread. So, what's the deal? Well, pick your poison. Endless screen time, social lives limited to Snapchat streaks, and, oh yeah, a front row seat to climate change and global chaos. And don't forget, inflation is out here crushing dreams. Owning a house now is realistic as winning an Oscar. But hey, at least there's 5G for constant doom scrolling. Gen Z's solution? Spend it while you got it. Because if the world is burning, you might as well buy that overpriced latte and pretend it's all fine. When it comes to fashion, Gen Z has raided the early 2000s closets that most millennials tried to burn. Hashtags like #Y2K and #Y2K aesthetic are blowing up with over 5.5 million posts because nothing says trendsetter like a Von Dutch hat. Low-rise jeans are back, and so is the constant risk of showing the world your whale tail every time you sit down. Thanks, Gen Z, for reviving that nightmare. Depop is now the hotspot for Gen Z vintage finds. Translation, they're hunting down our old Abercrombie tees like they're museum artifacts. If you're over 33 and still have that juicy couture tracksuit, congratulations! You're sitting on a gold mine of questionable fashion. And the naughties nostalgia doesn't stop there. While Gen Z will never know the bliss of charging a phone once a week, they are all about cases that make your iPhone look like that ancient relic archaeologists refer to as a BlackBerry. Meanwhile, Gen Alpha shops like their parents, which is adorable and also mildly terrifying at the same time. They're also skincare obsessed, getting worried about fine lines and wrinkles before they've even tackled acne. Maybe deal with that first zit before you worry about crow's feet. Scroll through social media and you'll see middle schoolers in full glam dishing out anti-aging tips like they're prepping for a high school reunion. Dermatologists are horrified, but Gen Alpha is already neck-deep in wrinkle creams and serums. They're obsessed with millennial skincare brands like Drunk Elephant, and although the oldest of them are only in high school, their favorite brands are like a suburban parent starter pack. Nike, Netflix, Disney, Nintendo, Amazon, and Apple. Even their fashion is old. Gen Z has noticed this. A few people in their 20s were invited by BuzzFeed and had the following to share about their Gen Alpha siblings. Everything is about how it looks, if it's cool. There are 8-year-olds dressing like people my age, and it's absolutely wild. This theme constantly came up in interviews with another Gen Zer, adding, "Back in my day, the cool girls wore sparkly sequin shirts. Now everyone in that age group wants to wear the same things as teenagers and young adults, which is fine, but it definitely is very different." And a lot of people in Gen Z don't think that the new beauty trends seen in their younger siblings are fine. One Gen Z teen girl shared, "My cousin is Gen Alpha, 9. She wears makeup every day and worries about her weight. It's like those 10-year-old Sephora kids. Why are they using $100 skincare? I started with literally only a cleansing wipe at age 11. This tracks with the general idea that Gen Alpha is shaping themselves not only after role models online, but after the people they spend the most time with, their parents. Having less real-life interactions and friends has led to Gen Alpha shopping, acting, and worrying about the same things as their millennial parents. Or to use the nonsense marketing term from Razorfish, they have accelerated brand maturity. But for Gen Z, perhaps nothing screams uncool louder than turning into a present-day millennial. But when it comes to remote work, they're a bit more analog. Only about 30% of Gen Z wants to go fully remote. Meanwhile, nearly half at 48% prefer hybrid setups, splitting time between home and office. Maybe all that COVID isolation and endless Zoom calls got to them because they're actually down to hang out with coworkers IRL. But as for careers, Gen Z is in it for the long haul. They want that work-life balance, don't we all? But they also are on the lookout for positions where they can grow, because TikTok fame and living in your parents' basement isn't the only life goal anymore. Gen Z's bold attitude toward the workplace hasn't gone unnoticed by their older coworkers. At a corporate level, one millennial says, "The largest difference I notice is that Gen Z, fresh out of college or university, is not afraid to call out a system that is not doing them justice and will look for other work without a second thought. But that independence? It's a double-edged sword. When things don't go their way, Gen Z disappears quicker than a Snapchat." The same coworker admits, "It doesn't disappoint me when I see some of them ghosting or leaving without explanation. I get it that you don't owe a company loyalty. However, sometimes it might be nice if more new hires spoke up about the issues they see." Gen Z might be one of the most educated generations yet, which is code for didn't work through high school. They were too busy nailing straight A's, plus $9 an hour at McDonald's doesn't even cover a latte these days. It appears they figured if they're gonna be broke, they might as well do it with a perfect GPA. In 2018, only 18% of Gen Z teens were working part-time, compared to 27% of millennials back in the day. As for Gen Alpha, they're headed for even longer school stints and fewer teen jobs, which means mom and dad's basement is booked well into their late 20s. And hey, Gen Alpha, if you think this means early retirement, think again. Experts say you'll likely be grinding well into your 70s. So enjoy those rent-free years because your dream of early retirement might just be a fairy tale. But here's the real question. When Gen Alpha finally joins the workforce, will they know how to office at all? Gen Z might be bold about their rights in the workplace, but ask their teachers and they'll tell you Gen Z plays by the rules. Their teachers rated them as much more obedient, respectful, and good with rules than Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha is a different story. Teachers described them as less respectful, less likely to share, and free from any rule. Sure, they've got accelerated brand maturity, but they are behind compared to students in previous years, socially, emotionally, and academically. It turns out being online since birth might have had its downsides. One teacher noticed that Gen Alpha has less general knowledge as the years go on. Teachers everywhere are shocked at the lack of basic knowledge. One teacher's class thought the U.S. Civil War took place in the 1920s. Google has replaced history class with close enough answers. Researchers interviewed preschool teachers in Antalya, Turkey, about their experiences with and perceptions of Gen Alpha students over the years, asking them to mark down their positive and negative traits. The three most commonly marked down traits were technology addicts, more tendency to violence, and egocentric. Bad emotional regulation is a theme that also comes up often when it comes to Gen Alpha. Researchers aren't sure if the problem is human disconnection, coddling from helicopter parents, or something else. But it seems that as Gen Alpha moves through school, teachers are having a lot more difficulty dealing with antisocial behavior, like violence, throwing things, and cursing at teachers. They believe Gen Alpha are fragile but unable to articulate why they're having a meltdown. But teachers don't blame the kids. One said, "I need to ask millennials, why are your kids so awful? And more importantly, why do you think it's so funny? Your kids cannot read, they cannot write, they are ill-mannered." Some might chalk up these complaints to the classic "kids these days" gripe that's been around since ancient Greece. But here's the twist. These frustrated teachers aren't ancient, they're in their 20s. So it's not a back in my day thing, it's more like a back in last Tuesday. Even they're baffled by the chaos in today's classroom. One TikToker says, "I'm a middle school teacher. I'm also 22 years old. And I will tell you, by far, we are doomed. These kids do not care." This is in contrast to all the headlines that are panicking about how Gen Z and Gen Alpha are drinking less, having less sex, and doing less drugs than ever. And somehow this is a bad thing. Who knew that responsible life choices would be the thing to freak out the older generations? But maybe it's not that simple. Sure, Gen Z is not knocking back the booze like it's 2002. 28% of college students in 2018 said no thanks to alcohol, up from 20% in the millennial heyday. But the older Gen Zers, they're still plenty familiar with the bottom of a bottle. In 2012, over 30% of millennials aged 18 to 20 were binge drinkers. By 2021, about 29% of 18 to 25-year-olds were doing the same. Not a huge swing, more like they've gone from ordering double shots to singles. Same party vibe, just slightly less puking in the parking lot. The real shift is with the younger Gen Z, where only about 4% of the teens were binge drinking in 2021, down from the wild 15% in 2012. As for Gen Alpha, they're also saying no to alcohol, but that doesn't mean it's all kale smoothies. Turns out they're exploring other options. In 2021, marijuana use among young adults shot up 13%, and hallucinogen use climbed almost 5%. So, it looks like they're just trading vodka for vibes. More harmful drugs are being used as well. Overdose deaths in boys jumped from 1.2 to 2.6 per 100,000 in just 1 year, with girls seeing a similar spike. But if Gen Alpha's got a vice, it's vaping. We finally put cigarettes in the ground, and now we're back to square one with a cloud of toxic fruit-flavored vapor. From 2017 to 2020, young adult vaping tripled. As Gen Alpha steps up, they're just cranking up the vape count. One Gen Zer told BuzzFeed that his 8-year-old brother's classmate brought a vape to school. How is an 8-year-old, a third grader, bringing a nicotine device to school? The Boys and Girls Club of America surveyed 130,000 members of Gen Alpha between the ages of 9 and 18 and found that only 10% have tried cigarettes and only 17% have tried alcohol. The Boys and Girls Club found that while only 10% of Gen Alpha has tried cigarettes and 17% alcohol, a whopping 55% of their substance users are vaping. Weed, 33%, alcohol, 26%. For a generation that's gonna be working into their 70s, vaping is probably not the best long-term hobby. But hey, nothing says bonding like a shared cloud of cotton candy mist. Want to see how the older generations compare? Then click on Millennials versus Generation Z.